One of the historical questions that always gets asked is how could Germany have won World War II? Many people question whether this was ever even a possibility, and the truth is, we will never know. But today, I am here to answer the question of how I think the Third Reich could have won the war. I've heard many people argue that Germany simply shouldn't have invaded the Soviet Union or declared war on the USA. But to me, this is just unrealistic, as for one, Hitler's plan all along was to invade Soviet Russia, and two, by December 1941, the United States, and in particular President Roosevelt, had made it pretty clear that they had no intention of remaining neutral. Hell, you could even argue that they'd already breached their neutrality through some of their actions in the early years of the war. Instead of putting forward unrealistic arguments like these, I'm going to focus on some tweaks and changes that could have been implemented and could have ultimately contributed to Germany's victory in the conflict. So without further ado, let's get into the first way Germany could have won World War II. The general consensus is that Germany were very successful up until Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, and this is largely true. The Germans had successfully invaded Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, France and the Balkans by this point, and with just the British Empire left standing, it seemed inevitable that Germany would stand victorious. One cheap answer that I'm going to give in this video is that Germany would have won the war if Winston Churchill was not Prime Minister at the time. It is no secret that Adolf Hitler made several peace offers to Britain after the fall of France in 1940, all the way up until May 1941. As far back as 1923, Hitler had stated in his book Mein Kampf that he had no desire to fight the British Empire, and even desired an alliance with them, as in his mind, Germany would not benefit from a weakened British Empire, and the only nations that would were the Japanese and the Americans. To a large extent, one of the main reasons that Hitler decided to invade the USSR in June 1941 was to get the Brits to surrender, as Winston Churchill was clinging on to the hope that he could drag Russia into the war and make Germany fight on two fronts, much as they had done in the First World War. However, if Churchill wasn't in power, it could have been a very different story. We all know how anti-war the previous Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was, and his stance was shared by many in the British public. Many Brits had witnessed the immense loss just 20 years prior in the Great War, and thought that Britain had little to gain but everything to lose entering another European war. Oswald Mosley's fascist anti-war movement had gained a lot of traction in the late 30s, and the Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII, had a notorious pro-German sentiment, even visiting the Reich in the mid-1930s. Hitler's peace terms were rather favourable to the British despite their vulnerable position at the time. Adolf Hitler offered to withdraw his forces from France, vow not to intervene with Britain or her empire, and even offered up German troops to help protect the British Empire. It seemed as though many Brits would have been willing to accept these terms, however, Winston Churchill was not. The reasons why are complicated. Churchill was stating at the time that Germany wanted to conquer Britain, and the threat of invasion became a huge fear in the UK, despite Operation Sea Lion never being a feasible possibility. Before the war, Winston Churchill had faded into obscurity, and was even mocked by many in Britain for his constant anti-German sentiment. His credibility was falling, and he was on the verge of bankruptcy. That's when a group known as the Focus approached him and offered him vast funds to continue with his mission. I won't go into all the details, but you can find out more about this group with a bit of research. The point is, Churchill's career and fortune was largely down to the backing of this group, who demanded that he continue the war or they would pull his funding. Long story short, this group would do anything in their power to continue the war, with the end goal being the creation of an Israeli state in the Middle East. Churchill and the media therefore continued their pro-war propaganda, and Britain carried on fighting, despite them standing to gain nothing from fighting Germany. My point is, with another leader in charge, such as Neville Chamberlain, Britain would have likely reached an armistice with Germany after the fall of France. This would have also meant that the United States would have almost certainly stayed out of the war, leaving Germany to solely focus on their conquest in the East. Without the US Lend-Lease, and with Germany not having to fight on two fronts, I think they would have stood a great chance against the Red Army. Let me know in the comments how you think that scenario would have played out, as it's time to move on to the second way that I think Germany could have won World War II. In In February 1941, the Afrika Korps were deployed to North Africa to reinforce the Italians who had been forced to retreat after being humiliated by British forces. Germany had initially agreed to leave the Italians to their own devices in the Mediterranean and focus on their own sphere of influence, but after witnessing their sheer incompetence and seeming unwillingness to fight from the Italians, Hitler decided to send approximately 33,000 men to back up his ally. These men fought under the leadership of the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. In our timeline, Rommel worked wonders and managed to reach the Egyptian border despite being significantly outnumbered by Allied forces. Rommel never had the sufficient strength nor supplies to wage his war of movement, largely due to the fact that Hitler and the German High Command had underestimated just how important this theatre of war would become. By this time, Germany was stepping up its preparations for Operation Barbarossa in the east, and they would soon have to once again bail out the Italians in Greece and the Balkans. For these reasons, Rommel never received the supplies and manpower needed to achieve victory in Africa. If Hitler had diverted some more forces into bolstering Rommel's strength in Africa, yes, this may have slightly undermined Operation Barbarossa, but I have no doubt that Rommel would have steamrolled his way across the plains of North Africa. This may have pressured the already war-weary Brits into negotiating an armistice. However, I do think that Britain would have still carried on the fight for the time being. By this time, Rommel would have reached the Suez Canal, and Operation Barbarossa would have been likely well underway. For one, Britain would have lost its vital supplies coming through the Suez, and two, it may have inspired Britain's Middle Eastern colonies to rise up. In our timeline, there was an unsuccessful Iraqi coup in 1941, but in this alternate timeline, with Rommel's forces being so close, they could have potentially continued their drive into the Middle East. The Germans could, in their words then, liberate these colonies. This would have also given the Germans access to more oil to continue their war on the Eastern Front. After witnessing such resounding successes in the Mediterranean, it's highly likely that Francisco Franco's Spain would have joined the Axis, taking the opportunity to seize Gibraltar from Britain. By this time, Britain's influence in the Mediterranean would have been severely reduced, if not nullified. Therefore, it is highly probable that Turkey could have also joined the Axis around this time for their own territorial gain. Turkey's involvement in the war would, in my opinion, guarantee German victory in this timeline, as Rommel, along with the Turkish forces, could drive north into the Soviet Union through the Caucasus in the summer of 1942 and link up with army groups south during Fall Blau, Germany's spring offensive of 1942. If this became a reality, the Germans would gain access to the oil fields of the Caucasus, and they would avoid the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, and by this time the Brits would have likely given up the will to fight, which would likely mean that the US would never get involved in the war in Europe. That was the second way that I think Germany could have won World War II. Let's move on to the third. The third way I think Germany could have won World War II is by focusing on the south during Operation Barbarossa as opposed to driving towards Moscow. It is widely known that Hitler diverted Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions south towards Ukraine after their victory at Smolensk, the last stepping stone before Moscow. Many people claim that this was Hitler's grave mistake. However, I disagree. Even if Guderian had continued to push towards Moscow, I don't think he'd have captured the capital city. His supply lines would have been stretched unbearably thin, and he would have still been slowed by the unfavourable Russian weather. Even if he did capture Moscow, I don't think Russia would have surrendered. Losing Moscow would have been more of a symbolic defeat as opposed to a strategic defeat. After all, Napoleon captured Moscow a century prior, and the Russians continued the fight until victory. I believe that Hitler was right to divert his forces south, and I actually think that this should have been the strategy at the beginning of Barbarossa. By capturing the breadbasket of Ukraine and then driving towards the Caucasus oil fields, the Germans could have cut off the Russian supplies and starved them into surrender. By focusing south in 1941, the Germans would have been in a more advanced position in 1942, ready for Fall Blau, and therefore they could have made it to the oil fields and Stalingrad before their supplies ran too thin. If Russia was cut off in 1942, some kind of armistice on the Eastern Front would likely have been reached, bringing an end to the war. The fourth and most realistic way that I think Germany could have won World War II is by treating the Eastern peoples with more dignity and respect. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Many Soviet people welcomed the Germans as liberators, particularly the Ukrainians who had suffered immense famine at the hands of Stalin. Alfred Rosenberg argued that the Nazis should utilize this to their advantage and recruit Eastern people to their fight against the Bolsheviks. However, this never came to fruition, and the Gauleiter of Ukraine, Erich Koch, treated the Ukrainians arguably just as bad as the communists had. This meant that the Ukrainian people came to resent the Germans. Despite this fact, many Eastern people did sign up for the Waffen-SS, particularly the people of the Baltics who wanted independence from the USSR. My point is that if the Germans had treated these people better, then they would have been more willing to join in the fight against communism. This would have led to a reduction in partisan activity behind the front lines and an increase in the number of troops that could have been used against the Red Army. This very well could have swung the tide of the war on the Eastern Front in Germany's favour and could have resulted in ultimate victory. That culminates my video on how I think Germany could have won World War II. Please leave your thoughts in the comments and let me know how you think the Axis could have won, if you even think that was ever a possibility. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time for some more History Takes.